Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Open University event in the 2021 Imagine Belfast Festival entitled Beyond the Now. It's been a challenging year for many of us, and that's indeed a gross understatement due to the many impacts of the pandemic across the globe and with many sectors severely affected. And certainly here in Ireland and across the world, the arts sector has been particularly hard hit. As we try to map a route beyond COVID-19, the arts can play an important role in renewing community and how we live together and how we work together. To help us explore our return to normality or whatever that will be, I'm really delighted to introduce a panel for this event today that I think covers a fantastic range of experiences and a fantastic range of work. The panel is Dr. Kim Charnley, Dr. Magella Clancy, Dr. Stephen Fellingham, Sarah Grievenu, and Jude Bennett. Dr. Kim Charnley is an art theorist, an art historian, and a lecturer in art history at the Open University. Dr. Magella Clancy is a Belfast-based artist and part-time lecturer at Ulster University. Dr. Stephen Fellingham works with drawing and social practice as a mediator of creative forms of social organisation and is a lecturer in postgrad studies at Plymouth College of Art. Sarah Grievenu is a curator, a writer, and is incoming curator of visual arts in Project Art Centre Dublin. And finally, Jude Bennett is a curator, cultural producer and activist from Belfast, who is now based in Denmark, where she is the Arts and Activism Projects Manager for the not-for-profit Roskilde Festival. Before I hand over to the panel, please do get involved in social media and share your thoughts using our Twitter handle at OU Belfast. And remember the Imagine Festival hashtag, hashtag Imagine Belfast. We'd love to see your posts, and I hope you enjoy the conversations that we're going to have over the next hour or so. So that's enough for me. I'd like to welcome our panel and hand over to Kim.
Hi, many thanks, John. That's great, and welcome to everybody. Very excited to have such a fantastic panel here today to discuss this really interesting and timely subject of the relationship between art and mutual aid. We've got a short little couple of presentation slides that I think will be popping up just a second. Here we go. I see them there. If we could skip to the next one, that would be brilliant. And okay, now are they full screen? I just want to make sure, because I don't have this as a kind of pinned. It would be great if that could be pinned now, if that's possible, just so everyone can see it full screen. It's not doing that for me, but maybe it is for everybody else. I'll press on. But on this slide, the presentation slide, what you'll see is Beyond the Now, which is a really, really exciting collaboration project with, as you can see across the bottom there, I hope, all of the partners involved. They include the Open University. I'm representative of the Open University here today. They also include Plymouth College of Art, and Stephen, who we'll hear from in just a second, is representative of Plymouth College of Art as part of Beyond the Now, but also Create, Ireland's collaborative arts agency, Co-Culture, Berlin-based arts organization, Counterpoints Arts, very important kind of commissioning organization working relationship between arts and migrant and refugees. Etijihat, a Beirut-based arts organization working with the Syrian diaspora. Mozilla Fest, a digital organization, activist organization working towards a safer internet. So you see a really, really interesting range of partners have come together to talk about social art practice for a post-pandemic world. Now, I'm hoping that we'll be able to drop a link into Beyond the Now, and you'll be able to kind of just find out more information about us and as an organization, as a partner organization in your own time. If we could skip to the next slide now, that would be brilliant. And we'll talk a little bit about the subject matter of today. There's a very, very brief introduction, which is just to say that mutual aid, the subject of today's discussion, is a term that I guess everyone's been hearing a lot of recently over the last year. It's very much come to the fore because of the crisis caused by the pandemic. It's a term that dates back at least to 1902, when it was the title of a book by the anarchist theorist Peter Kropotkin. So it's got a long history in activist organizing, focused on creating communities that address in a grassroots way, people's basic needs, and in so doing create kind of empowered individuals and empowered communities that are able to help themselves and one another. And that's a very, very brief kind of gloss on what's quite a fascinating theoretical and practical practice. As I said, it's got a very long history. What we're going to talk about today is what does that history have a relationship to art, or does that have a relationship to art? And can we skip to the next slide? And I'm just going to we might be able to kind of gloss over this slide a little bit because we've had the introduction from John, but I'm going to also just bring in Stephen here, who's also going to be kind of co-presenting, if that's the right term, today's panel.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. It's great to be here, and welcome again. Big welcome from me to the audience and to our partners as well. So it's beyond. I'm very pleased to be a part of Beyond and Now. It's been about a year in the making, as it were, and Plymouth College of Art was in there as a one of the founding members. So we're really pleased to be at this event today with this amazing panel, and thanks to John for doing the introduction. That was my job, but I'm very happy to have passed it over to you, John. So we've got a great conversation ahead of us, and I can say that in the pre-meetings we've had some very urgent discussions, I think, and this is a really timely discussion to be having around mutual aid and how that plays into the sense of art, if you like, and arts agency within mutual aid. So just to say that Beyond and Now, the season that has just come out on the social art practice platform is entitled Mutual Aid. So there's lots of I think now 3 contributions from practitioners to have a look at if you do actually manage to click the link during the discussion or afterwards. So please do have a look at that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. Okay, so I think we'll get started. I think we'll launch into it now. If we could, what we'll do is what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of start by, I hope, giving everyone an opportunity to kind of introduce themselves as well, by bringing around this theme and talking first of all to this theme. So I'm going to pick what we'll do with this first little kind of round is everyone's going to kind of say something from the panel around this question of mutual aid, and then we're going to see where we go with it, and we're going to kind of pick up the conversation as it goes along. Just to everyone who's here, in the audience, as it were, really would be great to get your thoughts too, to use the chat to do that, and we're going to aim to get as we go along, perhaps opportunities to address any questions or thoughts you may have, but if not as we go along, then we're going to leave some time at the end to try and pick up any of the questions that come in. Okay, so to launch us off, I think I'm going to go first, if this is okay. Sorry to kind of pick someone out, is to Sarah Grivu, who is, and that's because I can see you top of my screen, Sarah. But the first question I want to ask everybody is, does art, in your view, have a relationship to mutual aid?
So, yeah, I think when this question was first posed to me, when you first got in touch, and thank you so much for inviting me to be on the panel. I'm really happy to be here and happy to hear this really diverse group of people talk about their experiences today. But my first reaction was to say that I'm not sure, in a time of crisis, I'm not sure exactly what that relationship is. I'm not sure that art is always the right way to approach things when there's a need, an urgent need for mutual aid. And I guess part of the reason I was thinking that way was because my mind was going back to those first days of the pandemic, when there was so much uncertainty and we were just like trying to figure out what was happening. And of course, this is the anniversary, I guess, of the first lockdown, although we had lockdown a little bit earlier here. Mutual aid is a concept that, as an activist, I have a long kind of history with, and I've been very involved in different mutual aid initiatives, including those around abortion access here. And I'm super excited for the way it has kind of started to enter common language or a common understanding, or it's part of the discussion. But in those first days, my involvement with mutual aid felt very separate from my art work, or from the work and my interests professionally. I was like doing food deliveries, picking up things from the chemist for people, trying to create like lines of communication within our neighborhood to create a kind of a sense that we were looking after each other. And that just didn't feel like part of my art practice. It felt just like something else. It felt like part of my activist practice, or yeah. So yeah. And I think that when I thought a little bit more into the question, though, it's clear to me that my practice is threaded through with ideas around mutual aid, but just in that moment of crisis, they didn't mesh very well for me. So.
I think that's a really important point, Sarah, and a really appropriate one to begin with, which is that I guess that many of the, or I guess that many people who may be listening might have that anxiety that, you know, that one of the things that art sometimes is accused of doing is to appropriate lots and lots of different ideas, you know, in a way that might seem a little bit superficial, or may not betray, or may not engage with some of the kind of fundamental questions they involve. So it's a good to start with that note, although I think there are some counter arguments that I think we'll talk about, as I know you agree with.
I would love to make some of those counter arguments.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to come around again in a minute, but next we're going to go to Jude Bennett.
Hello. Lovely to be here. Yeah, I don't want to be super pessimistic, but I kind of agree with Sarah with regards to the activism or mutual aid being separate from art in a lot of cases in a time of crisis. My background, as mentioned, I'm creator, cultural producer, but from Belfast, and I wouldn't have, unlike Sarah, considered myself really an activist before. And though I was part of self-organized art groups such as Catalyst Arts, Queen Street Studios, those kind of things. And through that, in 15, when the humanitarian crisis with obviously the Syrian war and people crossing by any means possible into safety, I started refugee rescue with Joby Fox, who I met through the arts infrastructure in Belfast. So through that, I suppose, that urgency of the crisis, I realized it was taking a more activist approach. And in the beginning, this, because we were just a bunch of essentially people from Belfast running around the shores there trying to help. And then Jake Chapman of the Chapman Brothers bought our rescue boat, which lifted what we were doing, and we registered as a charity and all that stuff into a search and rescue NGO eventually. So it really was a hot topic at the time. Was this rescue boat an artwork? What we were doing an artwork because it was bought by an artist. As I think Majella posted, you know, Jake was very outspoken about the fact that it was just helping out where he could. I think he said if it was art, the boat was art, it would sink. So he was very provocative in his sort of that this was for sure not art, mutual, you know. So, but there is definite counter arguments, you know, to that. I think we'll probably go in more detail, but yeah, it's very fragile, I think, or sensitive, maybe, the relationship between arts and mutual aid and what is called socially engaged work, all these sort of kind of buzzwords. And I'm very careful around that, even though my job title now is Arts and Activism Projects Manager. So, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about that as well.
Thanks, Jude. And I think that, yeah, I think we'll definitely come back around to this because it's a very powerful project, refugee rescue, and all the kind of things that you just proposed there really raise that question about that line. And we can talk, yeah, you know, one of the interesting things, I guess, about this is that, as you said, that this is just in case anyone here may be familiar with some of the terminology. There's a kind of line of practice that's become very, very prominent around, which is sometimes called social engaged art, but there's lots of other words that are used to attract it, that kind of tends to blur the boundary between art and maybe activism or political action, and seeks to find kind of some political purchase from that. But there are many important debates, as Jude was just putting forward, about whether, you know, about how there are drawbacks to that sometimes, or whether there may be. And this is the kind of thing that I think this is raising straight away. That's brilliant. Thanks, Jude. Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Yeah, really apposite points, really. I suppose as a sort of basis, I'd sort of take a wide view, which you might sort of draw a line back to Joseph Beuys and social sculpture, with that sort of idea of mutual aid as an expression of a kind of creative act within the social body, where the art becomes the transaction, and rather than the capital being money, it suddenly becomes that sort of sense of a creative transaction. Non-alienated labour, I suppose, in many ways. So I have a passionate belief in that, coming from an educational background with, over the door of the college where I work, we've got social justice and creative education. So there's a sort of inherent belief in that as a precept, if you like. However, I'm also, the great caveat here is, that where art becomes a response to a situation or a crisis, that's where that starts to break down, and where perhaps we find what you might call hyper cooperation happening in a crisis situation. I like the pandemic, and I wonder what our conversation would be like now if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, or we weren't involved in these crisis situations, where we might start to talk about mutual aid in different terms, but nonetheless, here we are. It's real. I think it's much more difficult to sustain a creative act, if you like, in the face of an emergency, because what art does is kind of open out a space, or to sustain an ethical space of possibility within mutual aid, if you like, and it develops. In a crisis situation, it's really hard to develop, because it's actually about survival. That's the key word. It's not about development. It's about a sort of mode of survival. So what I'm saying, I suppose, is mutual aid as art in a crisis situation finds itself at a lack, if you like, because it's about survival rather than the development of this ethical space, or this space where art can point to another kind of thinking, or another possibility. So I suppose there really, fundamental belief in its efficacy, its agency, but in terms of crisis situations or emergency situations, I think potentially it's that argument starts to break down. So, looking forward to as you said, the counter arguments this morning.
Thanks, Stephen. That's brilliant. Thank you. Now, if you're watching, you'll see there's kind of lots of links dropping into the chat. So hopefully you'll be able to use those to just to kind of in your own time, pick up on any of the points that kind of being discussed, and it'll give hopefully a kind of a richer sense of the kind of background of this if some of it's unfamiliar. And thank you, Magella, who is actually doing that as we speak and taking control of that. Magella, I'm just going to check in with you because I know you've got your hands full with that, but do you have anything that you've got to kind of, do you want to kind of chip in on anything here whilst we're kind of on this go round?
Yeah, no, I just think it would be great if people have questions, they want to start feeding them into the chat, and I can sort of bring them together for towards the end. That would be really, really useful, because it would be great to get the audience involved as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to kind of pull together hopefully a little bit of kind of just where we started from there, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to offer the counter argument, because I think that there are some really, to summarize the fundamental points that I think we started with, they are that that in the middle of a crisis, mutual aid is about something which is kind of addressing people's fundamental needs, whether that may be food, clothing, physical safety, there's that kind of whole line to it. And the ethical dimension of that, sometimes maybe art is not where that is. Although on the other hand, as Jude discussed, or mentioned in relation to her project Refugee Rescue, the interesting thing about that project, though it's not art, it doesn't claim to be making artworks. A lot of the people who participated in it did come from an art background. They had been artists, curators, and so on. And that kind of sets up maybe a question about, well, what is it that artists, art professionals do, and the way that they interact with each other on a daily basis, and just kind of making things happen, has that got something about it that has this quality of mutual aid in the way that it kind of creates often grassroots organizations, things that are kind of sprung up, as it were, from nothing, just because there are people involved that wanted to help each other out, to share their work, to create, a kind of a space, as Stephen was saying, and as Sarah was saying, the space to kind of see some of the kind of experiences that are part of a community in a different light, which is often what art is able to do. So one of the counter arguments, one of the ways that people approach this question of mutual aid around socially engaged art is to sort of think about, what is it about art as a social type of activity that, is often done on a shoestring, often done, and there are bad sides to that too. It does need funding. This isn't to say that, art can exist without support on a larger scale, but often it is done in a self-initiated way. I wonder if anyone's got anything to say about that, or anything they would contribute about that kind of side of the kind of question of mutual aid in art from the panel. Sarah, brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can talk a little bit about a project that I actually have been working on over the last year, which I saw Magella dropped in a little link tree with some information about it. Yeah, so I mean, I think that just kind of following on from what people have said, for me, art works maybe best at a slightly different time scale. Like that thing of creating space for different types of social relations, or testing or experimenting with different types of social practice. So this project that I've been working on over the last year is called It's Not For You, We Did It. And it's a research project that's about cultural and political organizations that were operating in Derry in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Including Derry Film and Video Collective, or Workshop, and Camera Work Derry. And there was just like a whole swarm of activist organizations that surrounded those two organizations, and were, there was lots of crossover in terms of people that were involved. Both of those groups, cultural groups, were trying to think through representation, like the conflict in the North and representation of that, but also complexifying that with ideas around class and gender. But one of the things that's super interesting to me about that time and about those groups is the way that they were organizing themselves. So they were organizing with super like horizontal structures there that were problematic, and there's lots of things about that as well. But and they were collectively organized as well, and collectively not. I think there's lots of groups now that call themselves collectives, but sometimes they're not like collective in terms of like money, like the actual money that was paying people their wages was collectivized in these organizations. And just like digging into that a little bit or thinking about that, I mean, I suppose my ultimate goal is to kind of try to think about a genealogy of methods that were happening then that we can kind of draw on now to think about how we want to organize ourselves. And that becomes a kind of like, there is in those organizing methods, there is a kind of prefigurative politics of like, what could things look like? How could our cultural organizing look in the future in some way? And what's interesting to me about that is that it's not just artwork that represents that or is like pointing to that, but it actually was, they were living it, they were doing it, they were actually like prefiguring those things in some ways. And of course that was very temporary and it fell apart, and, you know, for all kinds of different reasons, like the pressures of like the context that they were working in. I'm not sure if that quite speaks to
No, it absolutely does speak to it. No, I think that's a really fantastic example, and the point about collectives is, I think, a very, very important one, because, as you say, this is, you know, and it's quite true that collectives in art have become more and more prominent, right? You know, there's more and more of them around, but it has a very strong link to this kind of question. And it's a bit paradoxical in some ways, because sometimes people think about art and artists as individuals, and a classical kind of idea about the artist being this kind of, you know, genius figure, male genius figure, all of those kinds of things that are built in to some degree into the ideological structure of art. But there's so many, well, collectives are a big part of trying to oppose that, you know, within art practice, right? But they cross over with political action and self-organized action in really interesting ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that there are lots of, like, for instance, studio collectives that are collective in the sense that they share like studio space and they have some kind of collective structures. I wonder sometimes what are the stakes in that? Like, how high are the stakes in terms of collective organizing? Like, if it's not about, yeah, it sometimes feels like it's thinking about those ideas, but maybe not embedded completely in collective structures or in what that actually means. And so I think it's super interesting to imagine how these things could return in a more concrete way or in a more embedded way.
For sure. Yeah, thank you. And maybe we'll come around to that one. I think that's a really, really important kind of dimension to it. I wonder, Jude, do you got any thoughts on this? Because I know that, as you mentioned, you worked in, I mean, you were a director for a while of Catalyst Arts. Is that right?
Yeah,
in
back in
Belfast.
2004. Yeah, I mean, I think to go back to your question, I mean, definitely there is a relationship between obviously self-organizing, like we did in Catalyst, doing what we can, you know, shifting to, you know, make it work. And it was that kind of approach that I think this sort of, you know, get amongst it, do it yourself approach is something that definitely came out in the project that I've mentioned, Refugee Rescue. And it very much, as I mentioned, started sort of very, very haphazard. But we were working on literally, you know, in a very, very shrinking political sphere. And we were doing humanitarian work that, you know, we were on the hoof, we were learning as we go. And then it got over the years and we just had to take the boat out of Greece because of Corona and the the threats to our team, the security threats from the governmental structure. So yeah, we were dealing with in a very serious situation. Lives were threatened, lives were lost. Obviously, we assisted thousands and thousands of people, but you know, to sort of attach art anywhere near that was you know, it's just not on the radar, pardon the pun. But it was just I did sort of think about like now in my job in Roskilde Festival. It's a not-for-profit festival. It supports lots of different initiatives. It gives 100% of its income to initiatives. So I think there's a parallel there, and what's important to me is the process, what art and the process of art can be at the center of these initiatives. And that can even be through maybe what could be seen more as publicity or awareness of issues such as in the search and rescue context, because it's sort of been my world for the last while. But so Banksy buying the boat for the feminist activist group to, you know, and it was obviously, you know, but through my channels, it was obviously a sort of gift, but it was within minutes of being out there. It was, you know, they were in the midst of a huge rescue, out completely, you know, so it's very serious. But also the role of artists supporting or co-creating something. There's also the forensic architecture or forensic oceanography, who work alongside NGOs like us, I think, and sort of initiatives like SAR Observatory, which is led by artists and lawyers and researchers, and that is collecting us the information we have as witness to the atrocities that's happening. So we're just like everyday people, you know, trying to you know, document what's happened, and how that will be processed, I don't know. But with forensic architecture, they you know, they use the footage to correlate, to triangulate different events as they do, to bring justice, you know. So it's crossing over a lot of layers there. So it's also really important, but it's just different ways. And I have mentioned, you know, if throwing or putting a ship that was sunk and killed over 1,000 people in the Venice Biennale is something that I even find hard to repeat. So it's
yeah, because we talked a bit about this, didn't we, just beforehand, and that latter work you just described is by Christophe Pouchal, and if anyone hasn't come across it, yeah, it's a, you know, this was an artwork that actually situated a ship that had sunk, as Jude said, on which hundreds of people had died, as a kind of provocative. I think the intention was to be provocative, of course, but not with any contextualization, right in the middle of the Venice Biennale of 2018, I think it was.
I think the challenge with that is, you know, being in that, and it cost the Italian Coast Guard 33 million euros to lift it and bring it there. And it's the same Italian Coast Guard who only today let Sea-Watch dock after 2 weeks at sea with hundreds of people on board. You know, it's really, that to me is just this political push and pull, and that's, I mean, we were political pawns, you know, doing this work, but we had to do it until we were forced out because of Corona.
It's a very powerful example, and just stitching it back into what we've just been talking about, there's a theme here, and it's a long-standing theme for activist artists around visibility, right? In what the arts can do is create visibility, you know, for and channel it and in support of things that wouldn't otherwise get noticed. But it's also a problem, that visibility, or it can be if it's used in, well, because it's part of politics, I guess, you know, and it can be used to obscure things too, as it is arguably in this case. Stephen, I wondered whether, just to kind of bring you in here, there's kind of another line that I mean, we kind of got lots of, it's such a rich field. There's lots coming through, but around kind of, whether you've got any thoughts on that, of course, we've just been talking about, but also around the way that arts infrastructure, we're talking about partly here too, might have a part to play in this kind of wider question of responses to crisis, to mutual aid, and so on.
Yeah, I think absolutely, Kim. I mean, what's been going through my mind of listening to the conversation so far is that it feels like that the title of the session should be Artists and Mutual Aid rather than Art and Mutual Aid, because I think there's lots of difficulty in when we start prefiguring what art is in terms of mutual aid, but what we're talking about is how artists act in these situations. And I think that, you know, I think, Jude, you're absolutely right. There's a great difficulty in raising your head above the operational into, if you like, the kind of executive mode of actually this is an art project, but actually I've got real day-to-day stuff going on that's absolutely critical. So we're all finding, you know, artists work in this space. Sometimes they produce art, but sometimes artists just work in the space. But unless they arrive as sort of human beings who have got that sort of depth of knowledge and ability to think naturally, I think is that, and to make connections which others don't make necessarily in those situations. And, you know, again, referring to the educational piece, that's what we're kind of inculcating in students as they're coming out, that sense of the ability to think across disciplines, to be, I suppose, to be transdisciplinary workers, if that's not too pejorative a term for an artist, is a transdisciplinary worker who's able to go into a space and actually relate across. And sometimes that produces art. I think that's a whole different subject to, I think, how the art world acts, and you know, I think the boat is still there in the Venice Biennale, isn't it? They haven't even shifted. They're arguing about who shifts it now. So it's actually a disgraceful and unethical piece of work that is kind of emblematic of how the art world acts in this space, where it picks up, uses art as a kind of art wash for the governmental art wash, but then also artists using that crisis situation to advance their careers and so forth. There's lots of difficulty in there, but again, it's complexity. You know, we're in a space of great complexity. It's immense nuances, but in the center of this is the figure of the artist, who is not the lone genius, as Kim most absolutely points out. It's a sort of pre-Renaissance point of the artist as a profoundly collaborative figure that has to work in teams, is a transdisciplinary figure that's able to bring something to a situation, and sometimes that is art, and sometimes it just isn't. It's just working. So that's, I suppose, is where at the moment I'm sort of sitting in this conversation. I think that it's about artists actually.
I'm going to open it out a little bit. Does anyone have any thoughts on artists in response to what Stephen just kind of framed really well? Go for it, Jude.
Yeah, I think just to talk about the artistic processes again, just like the project that we do at Roskilde is called Flocker, and it is where we help co-create with artists and NGOs, for example, more around the artistic process itself, and then it provides a platform, you know, a festival with 135,000 people. So it's again really placing art or the artist at the center, and how that can help the different solidarity partners, how they can look at things in a different way, how they can use artistic processes to expand their projects, and that's from small self-organized projects to bigger, like the Red Cross, or so it's how even bigger institutions can look at artist processes to take a more activist approach to it. So I think it's, yes, you're very right, it's very important. So I just wanted to...
Yeah, so that's a kind of infrastructural model too, right? Where you're kind of, as you said, you're putting that process there at the heart of what you're, of the way you're working with the artist. Would that be fair to say, Jude?
Yeah, exactly. And with the solidarity partners, which is different NGOs and stuff, so it's sort of using the experience, creative experience, to help develop activist projects.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, really interesting. Sarah, I'm wondering whether this gives us a route back into this question of collectivity that you kind of raised. In a way, your project, tell me if I'm wrong, but it was a kind of an archive type project, right? So it's a historical dimension to it too, as a kind of a way of reclaiming a history that maybe was incredibly formative, but could, may not have a wider audience.
Right. It feels like that time period had been forgotten a little bit. So it started from an interest in Derry Film and Video Collective specifically, and in a film that they made called Mother Ireland that I was super intrigued by. And like, I found, you can call it an archive of tapes, but it was really just like boxes of pneumatic tapes. Like nobody could view them. Like there's no equipment to kind of look at them or do anything with them. So the first step in that, in the process, was just like trying to find a way to have that like archive of file boxes of dusty tapes, like digitized, to create an actual archive that can be used by various people. And I think that maybe that kind of points to somehow how like a lot of the work of projects like that it's actually super unglamorous. It's like really, it's just like it's like a grind. Like you're in a basement with tapes and you're like making a giant spreadsheet to say what's there. And it's like the back end maybe of some of these projects that are like that have that longer kind of throw or longer interest in these methodologies. The back end is really labor intensive. and it needs that extended kind of period of time to come to some kind of fruition. But I think it's true as well that there's just like quiet, in terms of like arts infrastructure, there's often quietly, there are things that are happening in the background that could fall into this category of kind of mutual aid or like a community interest. Like in my kind of day job with Outburst Queer Arts Festival, like at the start of the pandemic, we flailed a lot to try to figure out what our move was. Like, what can we do to support artists? How can we like create some kind of feeling for people that they're being held a little bit by a community. So we like quietly found ways to like distribute funding for people to develop work. Yeah, I mean, yeah, one other thing that I wanted to talk about that really came up for me, because it was right around the start of and I know I'm sort of focusing on the pandemic. I guess this anniversary is really like in my mind.
No, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like, dude, like when I hear you speak about that work, that's like extends, it's like before the pandemic, it's happening now, it's going to continue to happen. Like, and the kind of life and death nature of that. I just think it's hugely important. And it's like, yeah, it feels like this is slightly at a different scale, but I think that's okay as well. It's okay to speak about those things. But one of the benefits, or one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this time of like working from home and everything going online, is that you can attend events everywhere. Like you can attend all kinds of things that wouldn't have been accessible to you. And I remember just about a year ago, there was an amazing show at Kunsthal Wien that had the Pirate Care Collective as part of that. And they're super interesting because they kind of point to and support different projects, like the Sea Rescue Project is one of the ones that was in as part of that. And again, like abortion rights kind of stuff. They're interested in things that are on the edge of legality, or that have totally crossed over that edge and are like about a kind of ethics that extends beyond what is legal within a particular state. But they did an amazing series of talks early on in the pandemic. And what's interesting to me about them is that they also are a group that they don't just point to the problem, they actually work on it. So they have like this amazing online, they're interested in like liberating knowledge, and they have an amazing online library of books to download. Again, not maybe 100% legal. But like that has been a complete lifeline for me and lots of other people, like to be able to access information in that way. So I'm sorry, I've jumped around a few different things, but
No, sure. I mean, I think that
questions. Yeah.
I think that those are. I think that where you've gone there is really important and helpful, I suppose, to tie it together. Because I think the point you made, Sarah, that one of the things about the pandemic experience is that it feels like a crisis. People's lives change, but then it makes us conscious that not everyone experiences it the same way, and it's fallen the harshest effects have tended to fall on those people who are already most exposed and already in situations that were terrible, or are terrible. And it's like, it does raise an ethical question about how to figure one's own situation within it. But that's also, perhaps, like you said, it's a kind of a thing that maybe drives us to want to understand better the kind of crises that extend beyond this particular one and have maybe been intensified by it. And as you say, often our activist projects, which I think Pirate Care might fall into that kind of situation or be classified in that way, are kind of looking at that strange boundary space that art is interested in very often, trying to kind of raise awareness of the different ways that people or different sorts of things that people are doing to try and mitigate some of the terrible stuff that continues to happen.
I wonder whether it would be useful to go to some of the questions in the...
Yeah, you're right, Stephen. Yes, absolutely.
Ujaila, what do we have in the that's emerging out?
Yeah, so we've gotten a couple of questions coming in. So a question here from Hannah, this was quite early on, asking, do you think there's however a space for art psychotherapy or psychosocial art projects that's providing support for people through crisis situations?
Of course, there's a space. There's a space for that. It's very important work. The psychotherapy, individual care, art therapy work, but we're talking a bit more in this case around collective sort of response. It's just another layer of engaging. So yeah, of course it's important, but it just wasn't. We took a very, very, very practical approach to the different projects, but we did produce recently a large sculptural work in Copenhagen. I live in Denmark now, that is by Martin Creed, and it simply just says understanding, and it's one of his rotating sculptures, huge. And I think because of the pandemic, it's been an even more contemplative space for people because it's outside. It's the only place people can go really in the city. So something that maybe would have been considered before quite spectacular kind of artwork has become this really contemplative space in the city. So that's sort of public artwork that's sort of having a collective experience around that. But maybe Sarah, you have more to add to
the question of like art therapy, or I mean, I definitely think that there's a place for that. I think maybe there's some kind of a distinction there for me around art that's like super instrumentalized, that has like a set outcome that you're trying to kind of get to. That's maybe a little bit different from some of the projects that I'm thinking about that are like, again, trying to create a kind of space for experimentation, or a space for different kinds of social relationships. But like, for people experiencing trauma, I think that is like it's amazing and can be a really essential part of managing that. So, yeah.
I think we have a very interesting comment that came in earlier on from Tundi. I'm just going to read it out, and maybe you would like to speak to this. It says, I think the relationship between social arts practice and mutual aid could take a very different shape if we consider pressing long-term urgencies like the climate crisis, environmental breakdown, and ecological emergencies. Socially engaged practices can have a strong impact on mobilizing and activating communities, moving towards collective thinking and acting and being, for example, creative cultural commons. So, I mean, I suppose, could we tease that out a little bit further in relation to what's already been said, maybe?
So it's a really interesting point. That, you know, that I guess that I would say that, just as a throw a possible thought in there, is that it spans so many different potential kind of activities that are going on. And this is one of the things about art activism, socially engaged art. It's got lots in it, you know, arguably some quite different kind of approaches, because it makes me think about, say, Extinction Rebellion's practices, you know, that are very visually acute kind of activist practices, you know, and, you know, that are in effect arguably types of art activist practices with the types of, you know, the types of kind of protest strategies that are used, that command visual attention, that kind of play and circulate very well, and that's a strategy for building pressure, you know. So all I'm saying is, I suppose that some of this is happening to some degree, but maybe you know, that and there are definitely activist practices that kind of work, or activist practices that work around environmentalist questions. But I think it's a very good point about the timescale, you know, and how one conceives around the timescale of these sorts of works and how they might contribute to a longer term visions. Don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that.
I mean, Kim, what struck me as you were talking was that the climate crisis is a much longer and slower crisis that nonetheless we are still going through. We are involved in, and like in similar, the pandemic is another kind of crisis. It's another slow moving one, and there's kind of qualities of crisis, if you like. So maybe that sense of how mutual aid operates in the context of an environmental catastrophe, if you like, if we acknowledge that crisis happening around us, then I suppose the potential there is for a greater sense of mutual aid happening in the ecological context than currently happens, because I suppose the urgency is clearly there. Whether or not it's percolated to sufficient levels of society to see that as a crisis is another matter. I think we could argue quite a lot about that. But I think the potential there in terms of why this conversation is so important and why thinking about mutual aid is so important is because it can play out in the climate crisis most certainly. And I'm not sure how much collaboration was going on between organisations before COVID, but certainly the pandemic has caused arts organisations to start to talk to each other much more. Not least because they just want to find out what's going on, but also outside of what we haven't talked about is the funding, the arts funding picture as well, which is plays a big part in how organisations work together, because often they're chasing the same pots of money. So there's a kind of I feel like a competitive rather than collaborative thing going on. So there is I think that space is open, I think, for mutual aid in terms of in the environmental crisis, and seeing that as with greater urgency than I would argue than we do currently in terms of many sectors of society.
Yeah, absolutely. I see we're kind of coming to quite close to the end of our time. Majella, were there any short?
There is maybe it's a question just about the image that's posted on our screens here. A question about where that workshop is from and the context in which it happened.
That workshop is from an image from a workshop that was posted by that was shared with Beyond the Now by Counterpoint Arts. I don't have the credit for that picture right in front of me right
in the chat. Counterpoint Arts has put a full kind of.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Brilliant.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I think it probably just falls to me now, and I guess to both Stephen and I to thank the panel so much for all these contributions. I mean, I think that loads of rich stuff there to kind of pull out in a very brief period of time, but I think very, very important framing for kind of this really interesting intersection between mutual aid and art and the different questions that it raises. So thank you. Stephen, I don't know if you've got anything you would like to say in conclusion.
That's fine, and thank you. I think we need to hand over to John to do the final closing comments, I think. But yes, but big thanks to the panelists of a really interesting discussion, and I agree, Kim, really timely. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.
Thank you,
Stephen. On behalf of the Open University here in Northern Ireland and the Imagine Festival, just to thank everybody for joining us online this morning. I thought it was a really fascinating discussion with some really great examples, and what an exemplary panel. We were really in your debt for that discussion that you led, and I think particular thanks to Majella, who populated the chat box with lots of interesting links, and there's a lot for us to sort of take on board. So have a good rest of the day. Keep an eye on the Imagine Festival program. It is a fantastic series of events, and it's one that we're very proud to be part of. So have a good rest of the day, everybody, and bye bye from a rather overcast Belfast. Take care.
Bye everyone. Thank you.